Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and today I'm joined, surprise, surprise, by Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg. If you've been keeping up, you know that we've just recently begun a series called Some Assembly Required. We're walking through the General Assembly schedule in order to give any of you newcomers just an impression of the whole week. And if you've been to GA before, this might be a little bit of review, but we're hoping that there's some refreshers in here for all of you veterans out there. Last time we looked at what happens before the gavel, so Monday and Tuesday of the week. And today we're going to zoom in just on Tuesday evening and look at the opening session of the General Assembly. To help us out in this discussion, we're happy to welcome friend of the show, Fred Greco. Fred, welcome back. Tell us how you've been. Do you have any exciting polity escapades that you can share with us of late?
Well, I'm doing well, Ben. It's good to be with you and Jared and Scott. I'm not sure it's strictly speaking a polity escapade, although it's polity permitted. 2 Lord's Days ago, I was in College Park, Maryland, to baptize my granddaughter, Lillian Eve Greco. And so the senior minister there allowed me to participate in that sacrament, and something that I'll remember, and I have a video to prove it. And so then came back here to Katy, and now, of course, coming up on Easter this coming Lord's Day.
Yeah, it's busy seasons for ministers. Guys, Jared, Scott, y'all excited for General Assembly? You look just absolutely ecstatic.
I'm not that excited this year.
One of my ruling elders asked me if there was anything like exciting happening, anything worth, like going out of his way to attend. And I said, well, not like previous years. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll be working and serving on overtures. It'll be an eventful assembly. I don't look forward to the work on overtures with the workload, but it'll be okay. We'll survive. I have a lot of decisions to make before the 51st GA, and so I'm not looking forward to any of them.
Well, you hear it here, folks. GA 2024, it'll be okay.
It'll be okay.
Okay.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be fun. I get a drive to this one. It's actually close enough for me to take my car rather than figure out flights.
You get to stand before the whole assembly too, and so that's exciting.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I've never really had a speech in front of the assembly from the floor before, so I'm starting in the front.
Me either, Jared. Me either.
I've never heard you speak at all at General Assembly, Fred. There's this loud Italian somewhere, but it's not you.
I'm very excited because I had the great privilege of preaching the opening worship service. That's one of the privileges of the outgoing moderator. So I'm excited about that.
Well, speaking of which, let's jump into Tuesday evening. Listeners, if you check your show notes, I'm planning to put some links in there. You can find the GA schedule and the GA docket, which usually line up pretty well. You can follow us along as we're looking at Tuesday evening. But 6 p.m., there's usually a musical prelude of some kind. And then 6:30 is the opening session of the General Assembly. And what we have first is a call to order by the outgoing moderator, which we're privileged to have on the show today. What's the significance of a call to order, guys? This is a fun show because we don't have many notes. And so I get to ask you questions that you're not prepared to answer. And I'm really happy about this. What's a call to order? What's the point?
Well, I think it's just letting people know that the assembly is open and that the business of the assembly will begin. I do think it's important for that call to order to happen before the worship service, so that it reminds us that the worship service is a part of the assembly. It's not a tack on. And I think that's important because, unlike, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, we are the Presbyterian Church in America. And so this is the gathering of the church. And so worship is appropriate. I will have to admit, Ben, though, that I have been known to make a statement that maybe will get me in trouble, in which I say often we have too much worship at General Assembly.
I can get on board with that.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when we had 3 complete, full-blown worship services to end each of the evenings. That's been scaled back a bit. Some of the worship is condensed some, and we don't come back for business Wednesday nights anymore. So there's been a little bit of a change with that. But I do think it's important for us to realize that as a church, worship is central to who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there really a gavel that you bang when you call to order? Is that'll happen? Yeah.
Do you get to keep that gavel?
Yeah, there is a gavel.
And that's the one that they'll give to you, right?
I would think so. Yes.
You should just take it. You know, that's what like in Hollywood when they're like shooting a movie like Iron Man, like, you know, they just take the helmet home with them after they're done because they've earned it. And so I don't care what they say. You should just take the gavel.
You know,
just steal the PCA gavel.
You need, you know, when you've got characters like you all and Howie and, you know, a bunch of other guys, you need to be able to keep people in order. One thing I have not been able to do, and, you know, maybe we could set up a GoFundMe for people to bribe me. I have never been able and always been tempted to say at some point during the assembly, I'm out of order. You're out of order. I'll channel my inner Al Pacino, but I've never been able to do that. So maybe this year. So take a look.
Don't you, as a former moderator, you'll always have the privilege of the floor. So you might as well just take the opportunity at some point.
That's right.
So the worship service follows the call to order, and we observe the Lord's Supper in this first worship service. Well, I mean, Jared and Scott, y'all might have some questions here. I mean, Fred already spoke to the significance of having a worship service at the General Assembly.
Can I say one thing about the service that I think is important? And that is that I think that the worship services, the last, I'm going to use a decade, have been far more unifying than they used to be. They're far more ordinary. Now, I know there's always going to be an element of something we do that there's going to be someone who stands up, you know, and says, you know, back in my day, we never had a choir or something like that. But in the main, everything we do is very common and ordinary in a PCA church on a Sunday. That has not always been the case.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's great about that is that it becomes a time of unifying. It becomes a good way to lead in the assembly. Men don't come in frustrated, concerned with complaints. And I've been very pleased with the way that host committees have worked. I think that's been a conscious effort over the past decade or so.
It reminds me of the stories of Robert Rayburn. Have you heard those stories during GA worship? He would stand up if he didn't find the worship acceptable, like dust off his coattails and then very proudly walk out of the assembly to show his distaste for what has happened. So that doesn't happen anymore, you're saying?
No, I have not.
He's saying it doesn't need to happen anymore, I think.
It might still happen.
Fred, I want to ask you a couple questions about being outgoing moderator. Maybe one is what responsibilities do you have even at this General Assembly leading up to it? And then, and then we'll answer that and we can jump around.
So the main responsibility that I think I have left, and it's really the main responsibility that doesn't happen the week of last year's assembly, is I select the conveners of the various committees of commissioners. So when you get those sheets, and if somebody wonders, you know, how did Bob get to be the convener? Did he, you know, put in a request? Did he, you know, send a donation into the AC? No, it actually, what happens is the outgoing moderator I'll get the list of everyone who's on the various committees of commissioners, and I get to select who the convener is. And as you men know, having been to assemblies, that often, but not always, the convener is elected as the chairman. I think that's more often in committees of commissioners other than overtures. But it's not always the case. So that's kind of an important responsibility. And then I'm responsible, although I didn't have to do much of this work, for typing up the report for the Cooperative Ministries Committee. You know, Brian and his staff did like 90% of that work, and I proofed it and added a few things, but technically I'm named there, but I'm not going to take credit for drafting all of that. And then really, other than that, my next duty is as the assembly is convened. This year I had a little bit of an additional duty, thanks to some folks who are on this call, who are members of the Presbytery of the Ascension, who will remain nameless, that I was, that there was a motion made that wound up carrying through the assembly that I would appoint a commission to draft a letter on transgender medical procedures with minors. And I had to do that and follow with the commission. The commission did a great work. People keep sending me notes saying how great the work is and thanking me. And I'm like, you need to thank them. They did all the hard work and they did it. But at this point, there are folks that think that I have some duties, like I have to go around and visit churches and, give speeches and kiss babies. And I don't have to do that.
But you did, didn't you? I mean,
well, I did kiss my granddaughter. That is definitely.
Have you already appointed all the conveners?
Sorry?
Have you already named all the conveners of the?
No, I don't even have the list yet because presbyteries still have an opportunity to appoint their representatives to the various committees of commissioners. I think there'll be a list that'll be mostly complete in like mid-April, as I think when you've got enough folks to choose from.
Jared, were you going to jump in there for anything on? Okay.
I was going to ask Fred to share the list, but if he doesn't have a list, here on Polity Matters, you have premium content here. You get the cutting edge of the list of conveners, the most interesting content.
Support our Patreon and you won't be selected as a convener. How about that, right?
I don't think I can do that because that would be upsetting all of the sports books that are taking money on who gets to be the conveners of which.
What about
I don't want to be the Shohei Ohtani of the PCA.
How about the outgoing moderator being privileged to get to preach that first worship service? How are you feeling about that? Have you selected a text? Do they assign you a text? I don't know how this works.
So it's different, I think, each year. It's either the moderator or his designee.
Mm-hmm.
And so you remember that last year, Randy Thompson preached at John Weiss's invitation. And one of my goals for this sermon is to follow in Randy's footsteps, to give an exegetical, biblical sermon to encourage the people. If you think you have any hint about how to vote on anything from my sermon, you're wrong. That's not going to happen. I don't intend to do that at all.
That's how subtle it will be. You won't.
I
love that. That's great.
I was asked by the host committee to preach on a certain topic. I have liberty to pick my text, which I will do. And so what they are hoping to do is to have the three sermon topics, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, be reflective of the PCA's unofficial model. And so because I am first, I have been given the topic that relates to the scriptures. So I will have the topic about being faithful to the scriptures. And then it's my understanding that the Wednesday sermon will be on true to the Reformed faith, and the Thursday sermon will be on obedient to the Great Commission. I haven't picked a text yet. There's so many great texts that you can pick from. If you all have suggestions, feel free to send them over to me and I'll look at them.
For the 50th assembly, when they were planning it, Randy had to have his text in by like October before. I guess it was because it was the 50th and they wanted to print some really nice work to go with it. But he had to like have outlines for the texts and sermon title and sermon text like a year, almost 8 months or so before he actually preached it.
Yeah, they haven't given me that order.
You are Fred Greco, though. You can get away with it.
So exactly, 100 minutes after the opening session begins, the assembly reconvenes at 8:10 for the opening reports and other matters that need to be addressed before before we get into really the meat and potatoes of it. So to start with, and Jared, I'm hoping you're going to jump in at some point. We're hearing very little from you, just for what it's worth. There's a report on enrollment and determining of a quorum. We talked about quorum for GA not long ago in an episode when we were working through the chapter 14, I suppose, and it won't be hard to hit a quorum. I think we'll be just fine. Numbers are looking to be pretty high again this year, even though we're sort of out of the central southeast. And then the election of a moderator. Maybe there's some comments here to make. I always hear guys talking about like, hey, do you know who's going to be nominated for moderator? Did you hear about this guy? Did you hear about this guy? How does this work? That is one question I have. Maybe Fred's got more input on this than any of the rest of us, but can anybody stand up and nominate anybody? Is that technically permissible on the floor when this point in the docket arrives?
It is. You don't need to submit any paperwork in advance. Typically about this time of year, there's, rumors about who, will be nominated. And, last year, I made known to people that I was intending to run for moderator. In advance, I talked with folks and asked them if they thought that that was a good idea. And I got a lot of encouragement. And then, I had already lined up my nominator, who, I tried to leverage everything I could, a good friend who knew me really well and has like the best accent. So
is it true that he wasn't planning to come to GA to do anything else except nominate you? I heard that rumor.
That is correct. Yes, he was sabbatical and on vacation with his wife, Sheena. This is David Strain we're talking about. And David came specifically to do that for me. When I found out about that, I said, David, I can find someone else. I'd love for you to do it, but I don't want to bind you on that. He said, no. Sheena insists, and we're going to, do that. So this year is a ruling elder year, so to speak. You guys are the polity matter guys. My understanding is that it's not required in our Constitution to alternate between teaching and ruling elders, unless you could point me to a provision that I've missed. But it's like a lot of things, it's a tradition.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know whether there would ever be a time when a teaching elder would be nominated in a ruling elder year or not. Probably would be frowned upon. It's interesting. I can't speak for what I might be when I'm 70 years old, but I had several people ask me if I ever intended to run for moderator again. And my answer was, well, no one's ever done that. And then they said, well, people don't normally get us out before dinner. So,
I'm hearing the groundwork being laid here for moderator for life proposition made by you. You're usurping our traditions by talking about the possibility of another TE who will not be named on this podcast that we're currently recording, who may be throwing his name in again. So are you announcing that you will be running again for moderator here?
I am not announcing that. No. Right now I've got enough work, on my way out, and I'm on overtures again this year. And so I'm busy enough at this.
I don't think we talked about it when we went through the church court stuff and moderators not long ago, but I'm pulling it back up. It's 10.3 that talks about moderators, and there is no provision for TE-RE rotation. There is that interesting thing we've talked about where that if there is no moderator, if there's no previous moderator either, you look for the oldest, longest standing member of the court to preach, and to act as moderator, which I would love to see happen. That would be fantastic.
Some 95-year-old emeritus.
Well, no, for real, like in 30 years to have Lig Duncan kind of hobble up to the podium. I mean, that would be just great. All right. Election of moderator. Usually there's a couple of guys nominated. There's big speeches given, in their favor, and then we vote. And then the presentation to the retiring moderator. This is where we assume they'll give you the gavel, or else you'll steal it at Scott's encouragement. There's usually a plaque, right? Yeah.
What do you do for the presentation of the retiring moderator? I remember Howie Donahoe's a few years ago because it was like 18 seconds. But what's required of you?
I think all I need to do is introduce the chairman of the administrative committee, the permanent committee. He's the one that actually makes the presentation. And
Okay.
so, and then I'll stand there. And if I follow in the footsteps of my good friend John Bice, I will shake the hand of the incoming moderator and get a picture. And that was kind of a neat way for me to start out being moderator, because John and I are good friends and have served together on the SJC for more than a decade and spent a lot of time together. Our wives have gotten to know each other at General Assembly. So even though that was short, it was still enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, from what I'm hearing here, if you play your cards right, you might get to do the presentation to the retiring moderator at some point. Yeah. Then we adopt the docket and start to appoint some helpers. But the docket, usually we have a docket already supplied for us on the GA website. If I'm not mistaken, we'll usually see a second or a third revision of that before we actually have something to adopt. Things will shift.
Yeah, usually the main changes are when we realize what overtures we might have that might require the super majorities, because it's hard to tell when everyone will be in the assembly hall. So when you need a vote of a majority of the commissioners enrolled, we try to do it that Tuesday night because that's when everyone is there. You can't guarantee that on a given Wednesday morning or Thursday afternoon, you'll have a majority of all enrolled. My guess is we'll probably have north of 2,000 commissioners again this year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's usually if there's an amendment to the docket that happens as business there, someone will move that. Usually the state clerk will recommend that, and that's when that will be made.
I've seen people make a motion for a special order of day if there's something that we need to work on or even on the first night or something like that. So usually it's just passed, but sometimes there's some special orders that somebody wants to do something to make sure we get it done in order to say implement an RAO before things get into later in the assembly.
Can you explain to me, like I'm five, the thresholds for how an RAO amendment is passed? Because it is probably the most confusing sentence in the entire RAO.
What's an RAO?
Yeah, so
A rule of
that's
assembly
RAO,
operations.
right?
Thank you.
What did you say?
That's RAO 20, right? Isn't that what it is that deals with the amendments? And what it says is the rules of assembly operations can be amended by a 2/3 vote of those voting, which must also be a majority of the total enrollment. So let's use, I don't like math. My wife is the mathematician in the house. So what that means is if you had 1,000 commissioners enrolled and there were 450 of them in the room and they all voted for this, it would fail, because it needs to be 2/3 of those voting, but it would need to be a majority of enrolled. So it would need to be more than 501 people voting, men voting. And of the 501 voting, 2/3 of them would need to be in favor. So it's actually a dual threshold is what it is.
So it's not a compounded one. It is, you just merely need a majority of all people registered present, and whoever's present, 2/3 of those present, as long as it's over a majority, must affirm the amendment.
That's correct. It's not 2/3 of those enrolled. It's only a majority enrolled voting, and then 2/3 of that voting block.
I've always seen it take like 15 minutes for some reason to figure out if we hit the threshold, but it seems much easier than that. You know, it should only take a few seconds in theory to determine if you have more than half the people there, and then whether it's 2/3.
Can you make a spreadsheet for this?
I can automate this.
That's what I'm saying.
I could automate this.
Yeah, you totally automate it.
We need to give him work right now, Ben and Jared. I want to see the spreadsheet of all the significant votes at General Assembly.
You probably have the
so
data for
hard.
some of that, Scott.
It's so hard. It's so hard. Well, it depends. Like, you have to determine what's significant, and there are such bad motions that waste so much time that are insignificant. And I commend you, Fred. Yours assembly was easy to track because you made us vote on everything. Actually, there's a lot of votes that you don't even in previous assemblies where it was, is there any objection? No. Okay, move on. We pass this. And so there's no data on whether you supported Overture 7 because the majority just approved it.
There's two reasons for that, Scott. The first is I think we should know what the mind of the assembly is. And then secondly, there's a pragmatic reason. And that is with the clickers, it's actually faster to do that than, to ask for an objection and one person objects and then you have people stand. And if you just say, let's vote with the clickers, it's very quick.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have to deal with the room with audible issues where it's like, was that louder? Was that not louder? Are those 50 plus one hands or 49? It really, just to look at it takes longer than for the machine to process it.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a vote years ago where someone made a motion to extend the time of debate. And this was before the clickers. And so we asked if there was objection, and there was, and then we voted, and they couldn't determine, and then we did a standing vote, and they couldn't determine, and then we did a vote with cards, and they went and counted, and it actually took longer to figure out the vote than if we had just gone the extra minutes.
That's one thing that occurs to me. We don't have. I don't see it listed. Where do we do the little presentation on the clickers with the dude in the bow tie who's amazing? I forget his name, but I would assume somewhere around the adoption of the docket or something like that. Maybe right after the retiring moderator, they'll jump up and make sure all our electronic voting devices are in order.
I actually think if I recall correctly, it is done before the election of the moderator.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
There'll be the report on enrollment and the quorum, and then he runs us through and he says how many people, rode a donkey to General Assembly and how many people took an electric vehicle and, that. And then we try to figure that out. And then that is followed by the now annual, my clicker doesn't work. Mm-hmm. It's not counting my vote. My clicker doesn't work. And then there's you need to sit in a certain spot or go change your clicker. And we spend about 10 minutes dealing with that. And the good news is that usually gets worked out before the first important vote, which is the election of the moderator.
And to your point, even then, even that 10 minutes spent figuring that out will save time in the long run by using electronic voting for everything else. Yeah. Well, I think my brain got a little mixed up. We started talking about the RAO, but
sorry, my bad.
No, that's all right. Let's just maybe talk real quick. Recording and assistant clerks, assistant parliamentarians. These are the men you see sitting up on either sides of the moderator podium at the table. There's a timer up there. They've got little placards and things. This is a great question, I think, because I've always wondered, what are they doing up there? What? Our presbytery has a clerk and one recording clerk. So what's going on with those guys up there? Jared, you might know some of this. I know you've known some of the men that have sat up there before. I'm sure Fred knows, but what can y'all help us understand?
Well, I do know there's a time parliamentarian that is keeping track of how long people are speaking, and there's different amounts of time that you can speak at different parts. A lot of times that's Per Omquist will be doing that. There's others that are just making sure that they record what the votes are. And then it seems like the moderator will consult them occasionally if there's some sort of question about the rules. I do have a question about if there's exactly how they are chosen. Is it just the moderator, or does the AC just have a list that they're going to do and that's just kind of rubber stamped? And maybe Fred can give us a little bit of insight in that.
So when I came up there, the state clerk had a list prepared for me of folks who were willing to serve and had experience, but that's not dispositive. So I'll give you an example. Two of the assistant parliamentarians, good friends of mine, John White and Sam Duncan, have been doing this for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And they know the rules and they know them well, and they have a sense of the assembly as well. I was more than glad for them to serve in that capacity. I let the state clerk know in advance that I intended to also appoint a friend of mine, Matt Bradley, who's in Nashville Presbytery, who is also kind of a BCO wonk, very knowledgeable about Robert's rules. He served as the state clerk of Nashville for many years. And I wanted him to be able to have service in there. So he sat up there with them. And there'll be times when, I don't know if you'll notice this, they'll be even conferring even when there's not a debate, because if they're wondering, is something going to go awry, or if they see something that might be counter to a rule, they will actually affirmatively come up. You may have noticed this a couple of times. This happened. One of them would come up and say something in my ear, and I'd be like, "Okay, wait, we can't do this. We've got to do that first." So they sort of prevent problems from happening, and that's really helpful because you have to understand the actual parliamentarian is the stated clerk, and the moderator is the one who rules on these things. But there's a lot of things that the stated clerk and the moderator have to do. There's a lot of people talking in your ear, sending you messages. You're talking to the timekeeper. You're looking to try to keep track of who's at the microphones. And so having these assistant parliamentarians and the folks who are the recording clerks means that you don't have to worry about that at all. If you've ever served on a small session, you're trying to make sure everything's recorded and you have to do 3 or 4 things at once. This makes it go very smoothly. And, the folks that have been doing this have been doing it a long time. And so it allows you to focus more on the substance.
And the committee of thanks, is that just Mel?
Well, it's interesting because for many, many, many years, it was Mel and, the teaching elder from Alabama, Henry Louis Smith. And if I understand this right, Henry Lewis was the genius behind the drafting, and Mel was the genius voice. And so Mel has been glad to serve that way. I did an inquiry. I did an inquiry in advance. I said, Mel, are you willing to do this? And obviously, Henry Louis Smith has gone on to glory. Is there anyone who can help you with it? And he suggested Caleb Cangelosi, who is a teaching elder in Presbytery of the Mississippi Valley and who worked what do you call it? Log College publication. So he's got a historical bent to him as well. And they put that draft together so that it's ready to go by the end of the assembly. And it's always enjoyable. They always do a great job, the Committee of Thanks.
We continue on, and that's about the end of the appointments and all the sort of housekeeping that has to take place. And we turn it over to the report of the stated clerk at this moment. And he's going to go through several different things. Many of them are important, and we need to pay attention to them. So there's statistics at first, right? So that would have to do with churches that have been added. The docket apparently just says generally statistics. I don't know what that's going to be about.
Might be pastors or
pastors leaving the denomination, pastors joining, dying.
Is there someone assigned during the statistics portion to keep Scott calm and in his seat when all of those coming out?
We just send them to the back. They just
okay.
Someone should compile those in a digital format. I know we do the normal church statistics in a digital format, but like actually tabulated instead of just a PDF. You could really create some fun graphs with that.
Oh, we got to pull that clip and throw it on the internet somewhere. You could really create some fun graphs with that.
A little known fact about how this is actually a very important report. People may not think about it at assembly, but it's used all year long. Like when I give my report to my congregation, they want to know how many members we have, how many churches we have, and all of that. And I want to take a moment here, Ben, to chastise any church listener who's listening to this podcast. If your church doesn't put statistics in, do it. Even if all you do is membership, so that we can get an idea of the number of members. If you don't know how much your church budgets for Christian education, you don't need to fill out the whole form, but to get that in there. And a few years ago, I helped draft an overture to make those statistics electronic, Scott. So now you can go to the AC website and pull down an Excel spreadsheet. It used to be you'd have to go and open the gray book and type in if you wanted to know anything. It wasn't even copy paste. And so I think that is just really helpful information. It's actually encouraging to our people because the PCA is one of the very few denominations that's actually, albeit small, growing. And that's, I think, an encouragement to our people to be able to see that. Number of baptisms, numbers of professions of faith, average attendance in Sunday school, charitable giving. This is something that, this is the way we get this information and can share it with congregations.
Yeah, I'm talking with Dr. Chappell right now about perhaps making even that information more useful. I sent y'all something that I've been working on for my BCO project and doing something similar to that with the statistical data where you can make it filterable, where you don't have to download individual presbyteries or individual years, but you can automatically filter things pretty quickly and generate whatever report you'd want to generate. And so maybe this year we can get something a little more fleshed out that could be helpful to the church.
Yeah.
Great. Listeners, I'll put links to those pages at the PCAAC website, especially if you need to send a link to your pastor or clerk of session for where they can go send their statistics. And so that way you will come out from underneath the chastisement of our moderator. We're going to hear reports here on how presbyteries voted across the year on the proposed amendments to the BCO. Scott, maybe you have got some details off the top of your mind here. I forget. There's three significant ones, but was it only three that we sent out this year?
Yeah. So what we'll consider this year are one on sexuality, one on officer titles, and one what's the last one on confessions? Is that the last topic? The last one.
38 confessions,
Yeah,
is that right?
I think so. And so this year, I think it'll be pretty run of the mill and quick. This could be a report that can take some time, especially if there is a loud minority concerning an item. This could be as quick as 15 minutes, taking them in gross, or it could be as long as taking each one individually. I don't think that'll be the case this year. But in years past, even in my time, we've taken and extracted certain amendments, and someone will say their piece before we ultimately vote on them. But this is the final part of adopting a change to our Constitution. And so it's an important part. My part in the PCA has been tracking the second stage of the overture, which is through the presbyteries. After it has a decision in the presbyteries, it then goes again finally before the assembly for final ratification. And so that takes place opening night right after the RAO votes, and there's sometimes debate on them.
And I think it's important to remember that these are these three parts. So we think about the first part, which is passing a general assembly. And then we think about the second part, which is the presbyteries. And in past years, there have been, will it pass, won't it pass? This year, I think they all passed in January. That's how lopsided it is. But there is this third part. It has to pass a second general assembly. And I was reminded when I was doing some research on something else that we had an amendment to, I think it was BCO 12, about a temporary session of a church in the presbytery. There was an amendment to require a ratification of a presbytery putting an interim session in place. And it passed the first General Assembly and passed the presbyteries by a pretty wide margin. And then at the third General Assembly, there was a pretty strong speech given against it, and it failed. And when that happens, it's done. It doesn't come up again. So what that means is if you're for these three overtures that are out there, you need to make sure you're there Tuesday night to vote for it, and you're paying attention.
That's good. And then we move into matters concerning the RAO, which we've already addressed to some degree, and why we would vote on these on Tuesday night is because we've got enough people present to make sure that they get through. So we'll see the chairman of the committee of commissioners from admin come up and give a partial report, and same thing for overtures, anything related to the RAO. Also, I suppose we say the same thing about the partial report of the SJC. So sometimes there's RAO things at play there that can be handled rather quickly in my experience.
Any amendments to the manual require the same majority.
Yeah.
So there's also a slot here for a partial report of the ACCOC. What RAO amendments would come from them opposed to the OC typically?
there might be an amendment, related to the RAO section on the administrative committee, for example. This is an interesting thing. There's an overture coming through. It's actually on the website now. I want to say it's overture 7 about clarifying RAO 11.5, who gets amendments to the Constitution. So I had written an amendment years ago that said that all amendments to the Constitution had to go through overtures, not through another committee. And then last year we had an issue that came up. What happens with an RAO amendment? Is that a part of the Constitution? And there was some back and forth. And anyway, so now this amendment that's coming out of Jared's presbytery would clarify that all amendments to both the BCO and the RAO come through overtures. Now, there are some other things then that people start to think about, like Review of Presbytery Records submits RAO amendments. And so can they do that? They've traditionally done that directly to the floor. RAO doesn't even, the RPR doesn't even meet at the assembly. And so one of the things that I've got in the back of my mind here and I'm working on this week is a further amendment that maybe would be an amendment either on its own or a change to Overture 7 to clarify when other permanent committees could make amendments. So that's a little bit still in flux. I would say in the main, what we're going to be seeing going forward is it would probably just be overtures and the SJC, not with amendments to the RAO, but with amendments to the operating manual of the commission.
That was a fun opportunity last year watching that whole thing play out. And it was the same overture number 2 last year, Overture 7, where every COC had to deliberate on it. And by golly, the state of the clerk was, I mean, he had to be everywhere at once, it seemed, in order to try to navigate this issue. It was an interesting part of the assembly that happened before the assembly ever took place. It was great to watch.
And it was fun for me because I got to channel my inner David Coffin. So, oftentimes if you have discussions about the Constitution, not all the time, but a lot of the time, David will say, well, I actually authored that vision. And this is what I was thinking when I authored it. And so when we were discussing that, I said, I actually authored that amendment. This is what my intention was in authoring that amendment. So,
Fred, you've already referred, I think, to the Cooperative Ministries Committee. Because as a moderator, you're put on that committee, aren't you, for 5 or 6 years running?
It's the heads of each of the committees and agencies, and the last, I think it's 6 moderators. And the immediate previous moderator or the sitting moderator presides over the meeting, which I did in January.
What type of work does that committee do?
It's interesting. If you look at that, some folks have looked at that provision and think it's very scary, like it's very top down, and this committee is going to be sending BCO amendments and changing. It's basically a 3-hour meeting in which the various heads of the committee say, this is what we're doing this year. This is what we're doing this year. And then they might say, well, you're doing that. We're doing something similar. We should partner on that. It's really not very substantive. Probably the most substantive thing is the stated clerk let all of them know about this Overture 7 to clarify RAO 11.5. So they were all aware of it and saw what was the intention and what was going on with it. And so, it was an enjoyable meeting, but it was not really heavy lifting.
Listeners might want to refer back to our episode on chapter 14 of the book, where we looked at, especially in 14.1, the language related to the permanent committees and agencies. They're not to serve; they're there to serve and not direct any church judicatories. They're to not to establish policy, but execute policy. They serve through the duties assigned by the GA. So I'm imagining, Fred, are you saying basically that committee just helps make sure that they aren't stepping on each other's toes as they seek to serve the General Assembly in the long run? Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
It can sound like a kind of a scary thing.
Yeah.
Jared, what's the Committee of Constitutional Business? Can I ask you that? Do you know?
It's a committee that will give some advice on whether, especially overtures that are going to be coming up, are in conflict with other parts of the Constitution. So if somebody wants to do something and another part of the BCO would then be in conflict with it, to let them know when they're editing that in overtures, or some other business like that. So it's kind of a committee to make sure that we're not going to do anything that our standards tell us that we're not supposed to do.
Hmm.
And it takes questions as well. So it doesn't just do overtures. It will take, if somebody submits a question to them that seems to be substantial, they'll have their own rationale behind it. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a rationale concerning all of that stuff we just talked about with Overture 7 on should the OC take an amendment, for example, out of the hands of another committee. Is that permissible? I wouldn't be surprised if we have a CCB report or something on that from someone in the AC or something. And so it does more than just amendments. It will take questions of inquiry as well.
Yeah, and that's what we sometimes talk about when we're going through the BCO, is sometimes there'll be a report particularly about that, and Morton Smith will cite that in his commentary whenever there's a new CCB report or inquiry.
And one thing that's very important about that, though, is it's an advisory committee. So CCB could say an overture is in conflict with the Constitution, and the Assembly could still pass it. They don't have to do what CCB says. It's not a judicial body. It's an advisory body. And CCB can be wrong. And CCB can give helpful advice that can stop, conundrums from occurring. But it is merely advice. And they give that advice in advance to the Overtures Committee. So if the Overtures Committee wants to perfect overtures, they can. But that advice is also available to the Assembly at large. That might convince someone, for example, who's a commissioner, to vote against the Overtures recommendation, a recommendation of the Overtures Committee, simply because they think it's not wise.
And then the last thing, at least on the docket for Tuesday evening, is the report of the Theological Examining Committee. Again, you might remember back to BCO 14 talking about GA, that this is the committee that examines, and I have to go and read it because the language is so foreign to me, but all first and second level administrative officers of committees, boards, and agencies, and those acting temporarily in these positions and are being recommended for full-time employment need to be examined as to their theological views and knowledge before they can be appointed to these roles. Not always a very long report. Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
Well, it's especially important if there's a change in who's heading a certain committee that year, or who's being appointed, so that when that committee's report comes up, we can already have that report and have heard if they have any exceptions or things like that before that happens.
How do you categorize these things? What's a first or second level administrative officer?
I think it's basically presidents and vice presidents. So, for example, you might not think about this, but the vice president for advancement at Covenant College, who's like the chief fundraiser, he needs to be examined by the Theological Examining Committee, even though he doesn't have to be a teaching elder or even a ruling elder for that matter. But because of his position within the organization, it's required that they examine him.
So the guy or the lady that replaced John Robertson, will she be examined by the TEC?
I would think so, but I don't know.
That was not meant to be a controversial question. It was more of a curiosity.
Really? That's not meant to be a controversial question? Come on.
The reason why I don't know about it is I don't know if an employee of the AC qualifies as a first or second level. So, for example, as I said, let's say that you had at, Covenant College, a vice president in charge of library affairs. That could certainly be a woman. It doesn't have to be an ordained man in that position, but they would still need to be examined to make sure they're within the bounds of our polity and our theology. So remember, this is not an ordination exam. And this is not, required for someone to be, it's not a substitute for a presbytery exam. So if a person in that position were a teaching elder, they would need to be examined by their presbytery. If a person in that position happened to be a ruling elder, they would need to be examined by their session. But this is another layer that says, regardless of whether you're a teaching elder in good standing or not, if you're going to be in this position, the Theological Examining Committee gets to examine you.
Hmm. I heard it's a great committee to be on because their work is very brief. They don't have a lot of work every year.
I think you mispronounced that. You're supposed to, it was exciting.
Concise.
Exciting is the
Exciting,
word, is the word
sorry.
you were looking
That's
for.
great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exciting and concise.
Um, well, guys, we've covered it. What else is there anything else from Tuesday night that stands out to you? We've taken about as long as all of this takes to talk about it. So, um, this is very good though. That's helpful to understand some of these things that sometimes fly
Is that
by
when
on Tuesday night.
is that when the ice cream social has been?
I'm not aware of where the ice cream social sits on the schedule this year, but we will find out and let you know, dear listeners. Don't you worry.
Now,
I
wait a
think this
minute.
is where it is.
This is it. I can tell you it's Tuesday night. I don't think we've had ice cream social for years. It's been at least a few years since we've had one. I don't think we've had one since COVID.
Mr. Moderator, we have a job for you.
Well,
We need to find a way to get some Bluebell there.
that's
Make
right.
ice cream socials great again, Fred. That's your motto this year.
Fred, before we go, we've got a few questions related to GA. They're just kind of fun to talk about. But we also neglected to answer these ourselves last week. But I think maybe instead of all of us answering, I'm going to ask Fred and Jared these questions, and then maybe in future weeks, Scott and I can answer these along with our guests that are coming up. But so Fred and Jared, both, what's been your favorite General Assembly memory, or one of them? I'm sure there are many.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say, being elected moderator was a great honor and able to do that. Um, I will say one of my other humorous memories is I was chairman of Overtures, probably 15 or more years ago. And we had a very controversial subject. And I was giving the report of the committee, and the current stated clerk was giving the report of a minority. And it was a very controverted issue. And the committee's view prevailed. And a lot of folks were happy about that and glad that I did the work and thought I did, a good job. I was younger then, had less gray hair. And a friend of mine, though, came up to me and he said, "Fred, great job. Next time, wear a tie." Because, of course, I had an open collar tie on. Now, this is really, I'm dating myself because I'm in assembly. And last year was the first year I brought a suit because I thought I had a chance to be moderator. This year I have to bring a suit to preach. Normally I'm in my blue blazer and a khakis, the PCA uniform. I don't normally ever wear a tie. But that's not controversial now because now guys come in flip flops and Hawaiian shirts, and you never know what Bob Mattis is going to wear. So, you know, anyway, I thought that was a humorous event.
I think I may have shared mine in a different context, but some know that an esteemed man named Jay Nykirk is our stated clerk in Ascension Presbytery, and he was on Overtures with me last year. And at one point, I went to make a motion, and after I was done making the motion, he immediately got up and said, "Okay, I'd like to make an amendment." And he did about three different parts of things that would need to be fixed in order for the motion to be decent. And then he said, "And then if I get a second, I'd like to speak for my amendment. And then later, I'm going to speak against us doing it at all." And so he actually helped perfect my motion because if we were going to do it, he wanted it to be done well, but he was against it. And that was probably one of my favorite moments because that's Jay, and that's also, I thought, like, that's the type of churchman I want to be. I want to be somebody that helps us do the best that we do, even if I end up being against it.
What about y'all's favorite swag? Big part of General Assembly is going through the exhibition. Nope, not exhibitor. Sorry, exhibitors hall, not the exhibition hall. And picking up stuff and talking to people and making connections. What's your favorite swag, or do you have any swag you've missed from previous years that you'd like to see returned?
I don't know if we still have this. You guys can remind me because I didn't go to the hall once, surprise, last year. So I don't know if they still do this, but this coming up is, I think, my 22nd General Assembly. And so my wife is very fond of the great bags that we get our material in. So I get the material and I immediately hand the bag over to her, and she, puts her stuff in it, and that's it. I can't tell you the number of years that all of my children were clothed with Covenant College t-shirts. Because, I would go and I'd get like 5, and just do that. And I still have about a half dozen MTW mugs from Colombia, from Thailand, from, wherever it is. I love all of those. I don't know if they do that anymore. And if they don't, let's make swag great again. I mean, I like that a lot.
I think Perry referenced those mugs last week when he was asked the same question. They're popular. Jared?
Yeah, I'd have to add that one of my favorite used to be the RUF 10s. I still have a bunch of them. And then once I turned 40, I started reusing them, not only to put breath mints in, but also Advil and Pepto-Bismol.
Yes. And lastly, before we finish up, guys, any tips for preparation for General Assembly? So maybe thinking especially about men that haven't been very often and are still kind of learning the ropes. What would you suggest to them as they plan their trip to General Assembly and their preparation for the court meeting?
I think as much as you can, have the material in a way that you can find things easily. So download. What I always do is I download not only the commissioner's handbook, but I download all the individual files and I put them in a folder. So if I need to switch from MTW back to nominating over to overtures, I can do it quickly. I can also have multiple files open in various tabs. Especially as we move away from paper, download things in advance because it's hard to get on the Wi-Fi. There's just so many people. If you have a tablet that has cellular, bring it. Or if you don't, learn how to hotspot your phone. That will save you some grief in doing that. Learn how to organize things, take notes, even just so you know what the overture numbers are, what their names are, and those various sorts of things. Last year I didn't, but this year I will again put out my document regarding recommendations for the assembly. There are others that do the same, having that just so you can find things and know what's going on. As much as you can do that in advance and you're not trying to desperately get on the Wi-Fi and swipe on the floor is, I think, a big advantage.
Fred, for our listeners, what would be the best way for them to get access to that document once you release it? Could they contact us and we could connect them with you?
Yeah.
Would that be acceptable? Yeah.
Yeah. So what I do is I send it out via email, kind of old schoolish. I don't put it up, on social media and such like that. I do send it to anyone who wants it. I don't have a certain vote mindset in line. I've had, lay people ask me for it so they can follow. I don't mind doing that either. And I keep a list, which is now very long. But if you do, you can either email me directly if you've got my email address, or they can contact you all and you can send me. Yep. All I need is a name and a valid email.
Jared, what are your tips?
Mine would be food related. Plan your lunches. See if you can sign up for cheap lunches because it's really hard to get off of campus and then back in the middle of business. And I always put a couple of granola bars in my bag in case I just have to skip a meal. Then I'm set to go. So.
RTS usually does a free luncheon at some point during the week. So if you stay in tune for that, that's a good one to watch out for. Well, as every outgoing moderator would say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to come back next time when we continue walking through the week of General Assembly with our guest, Mel Duncan. We're going to talk about what happens on Wednesday related to most of the permanent agency and committee reports that come to the floor. If you're interested in learning more about what we've talked about today, check the show notes in your podcast player, or you can go to see those at politymatters.org. We are always glad to have Fred on the show. Many thanks to you, sir, for joining us today. If you've enjoyed it, consider following us on Twitter and Facebook at Polity Matters, and be sure to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and you'll get us delivered directly to your phone or a computer or wherever else you listen to podcasts every Tuesday morning. If you've got questions or comments, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. You can also reach out there if you're interested in getting Fred's overtures advice as he gets it going later in the week. If you want to email me at that location, I'd be happy to pass your information along to the moderator. You can find me and Jared and Scott all on Twitter. You can check the show notes for the links. You can get in touch with us there if you need to. Thanks again for spending your time with us. We're always glad to have you. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, gentlemen.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Y'all take care.